Thank you. Thank you very much. Just out of curiosity, how many people are here for the first time this year? Oh my God, look around the room. That's amazing. Welcome, and it's really exciting to see this movement expanding like this. Fabulous. So today I'll talk about understanding the psychology of carnism, or eating animals, for effective vegan advocacy. Most of the focus of this presentation will be on effective vegan advocacy, not simply on the why, but really on the how. Now, I want to start by sharing a quote with you from a famous traumatologist, psychiatrist, who says that the ordinary response to atrocities are mass traumas, are mass traumatizations, is to banish them from consciousness. Atrocities, however, refuse to be buried. Equally as powerful as the desire to deny atrocities is the will to proclaim them aloud. So I'm curious about how many of you can relate to this. I'm curious about your experience. How many of you notice that people turn away when you try to talk about the atrocity of carnism, of eating animals? So you've had this experience. And how many of you can relate to this desire to speak out? Okay, you get it, right? And when you do speak out, of course, this is how people respond. Or maybe it's more like this. So what's going... Oh, my slide is cut off a little bit. On the bottom it says, "You crazy vegan hippie propagandist." So, I mean, what's going on here? If you think about it, when we talk about veganism, when we're advocating veganism, we're advocating compassion and justice, moral consistency, and health. But the way people respond, you'd think that we were advocating racism or something. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Why is it that people turn away from something that seems so naturally, that actually is so naturally aligned with their values, with core human values? And, as I said, the focus will be even more so on how. How can we bypass this resistance so that people are more receptive to the message that we bring as vegan advocates? So let's start with the why. Now, a lot of you here are already familiar with my work on the psychology of eating animals, or the psychology of carnism, so I'm going to just very quickly talk about what this is. So my work has been, as I said, on carnism. Carnism is the invisible belief system or ideology that conditions people to eat certain animals. You can think of carnism as sort of a sub-ideology of speciesism, just like anti-Semitism, for example, is a sub-ideology of racism. Now, carnism is what's called a dominant ideology. That means it's institutionalized. It's embraced and maintained by all major social institutions, from the family to the state. So it's woven through the very structure of society, shaping norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. And it therefore becomes internalized, shaping the very way we think and feel about eating animals. In other words, when we are born into a dominant system such as carnism, we learn to look at the world through the lens of carnism. Carnism, as you all know here, is a violent ideology. It's organized around violence, and it is counter to core human values, values such as compassion and justice, that virtually all human beings espouse. So, like other dominant violent ideologies, carnism needs to use a set of defense mechanisms so that compassionate people act against their core values without fully realizing what they're doing. And the defense mechanisms operate something like this. The ideology creates defenses, which are a set of myths, fictions, that distort perceptions, that block our feelings, that enable our behaviors. And this should be a circle, but I couldn't make it into a circle on my Mac. So just imagine that it's a circle and a feedback loop. And here is a specific example of what this looks like. So carnism uses the defense objectification. It teaches us to think of animals as things, as objects. When we think of animals as things, we think of, for example, a turkey as something rather than someone. So this is a distorted perception. And therefore, our emotions are numbed. We don't feel our natural empathy towards the turkey. We don't feel the probably natural disgust that we would feel at the idea of eating the turkey. And therefore, we eat turkeys. And the more we eat turkeys, the more we do what? Exactly. We reinforce this belief in carnism. We reinforce carnism. So does that make sense? Right? So this is like a feedback loop. Now, carnism, like other violent ideologies, dominant violent ideologies, needs to use what I refer to as a two-pronged strategy in order to keep itself alive, in order to maintain itself. It needs to strengthen itself, strengthen carnism, and what else does it need to do? Exactly. Weaken veganism. So carnism uses defense mechanisms that do both of these things. The defenses that the first part of my work has focused on are what I now refer to as primary defenses. These are defenses that strengthen carnism. They validate this idea that eating animals is the right thing to do. Carnism also uses what I call secondary defenses. These are defenses that weaken veganism or invalidate veganism. They teach us to believe that not eating animals or veganism is the wrong thing to do. So let me really briefly give you an example of primary and secondary defenses. So one primary defense is justification, right? We learn to believe in what I refer to as the three ends of justification. Eating animals is normal, you guys know this, natural and necessary. The same defense that we have used to support other violent practices throughout human history, such as slavery, male dominance, heterosexual supremacy. Another example of a carnistic defense or a primary carnistic defense is de-individualization or seeing animals as abstractions. We don't recognize the individuality or the personality of farmed animals, and instead we see them as an abstract group. So we learn to believe that like a pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. An example of secondary defenses. Secondary defenses are often used or expressed through projection. Do you guys know what projection is here? You see in others what's actually happening in yourself, like the dominant group projects onto the non-dominant group, vegans, something that's actually a reflection of the dominant group. So, for example, we learn to think of vegans or call vegans as biased and extremist. Have you guys heard this? You've heard this plenty of, right? The vegan bias. We don't recognize that carnistic bias is built right into the very foundations of society, that when we study nutrition, for example, we're actually studying carnistic nutrition. So we're called biased and extremist when we challenge the biases and extreme practices of the dominant culture. Or we might be called tofu-loving, tree-hugging hippies when we advocate peace, right? So secondary defenses are a form of shooting the messenger. They often stereotype vegans. If we shoot the messenger, we don't have to take seriously the implications of their message. And there's nothing wrong with being a hippie, believe me. But there is a problem with being reduced to simply a one-dimensional stereotype. Sometimes we're called angry human haters or militant human haters when we express our outrage at the atrocity that is carnism. Can you guys relate to this? And we're often expected to be super vegans who never what? How many of you, seriously, how many of you have pretended that you're not sick? when you have a cold or something, because you don't want it to be used as an excuse to invalidate your entire ideology. Right? But when the guy next door has like a quadruple bypass, like open heart surgery, he's got bad genetics. So we're super vegans who never get angry, who never wear wool, who never, we never wear, for example, we're hypocrites if we wear a used wool sweater, but we're extremists if we don't. We're never hypocritical, we're never angry, we're never sick. So we are expected to live up to this sort of impossible ideal. So it's important to recognize that carnistic defenses, these secondary carnistic defenses, are part of a backlash against veganism. Does everyone here know what a backlash is? Backlash is a reaction of the dominant culture when its power is threatened. When we threaten to change a massive, institutionalized, deeply entrenched system that has been in existence for many, many, many years, it's a multi-trillion-dollar system, it's not going to just roll over and die. It's going to fight back. Very often vegans say to me, they're so depressed, they're so frustrated because of so-called happy meat. You guys know happy meat? Biofleisch, organic meat. And, that's understandable. But I often explain that, happy meat happened not in spite of our efforts, but because of them. The fact that we have happy meat now, in my opinion, this is a construct that was created by the meat industry, meat, egg, and dairy industry, is a reflection of the fact that we are succeeding, not that we are failing. And it's really important to recognize that. So this secondary defenses intensify as the vegan movement is increasingly successful, and the intensity of carnism, carnism starts to fight back more and more. All right, so this brings us to the how. What are some specific principles and strategies that we can employ in order to bypass or not trigger these carnistic defenses? Well, to start out, it's important to recognize that effective vegan advocacy is communicating in a way that increases the chances that the other will allow themselves to be influenced. The other will allow themselves to take this information in. It is not about changing hearts and minds. We can't force people to change. It's about opening hearts and minds. That is our goal when we advocate and we communicate. Can we create an environment, can we communicate in a way that increases the chances that the listener will be open to our message? What the listener does with that message is out of our control. All we can do is try to deliver our message in a way so that they are hopefully more open to hearing what we have to say. Here are some principles and tools in order to do that. First of all, it's very helpful to recognize that the facts do not sell the ideology. So often we believe, how many of you can relate to this, that if only you know the truth with a capital T about eating animals, you'll never want to eat animals again. Do you feel this way? I just want you to see the truth. And then you show them earthlings or something. And the next day they're at McDonald's. And you're saying, what kind of a psychopath am I dealing with here? The facts don't sell the ideology. If they did, the world would be vegan. The facts are on our side. You can't deny them. Not intellectually, anyway. People do not change until they are ready to change. It's that simple. We can't make somebody ready to change. But if we recognize that the facts don't sell the ideology, we won't be so frustrated with people who learn the facts and then don't change. And we won't lose faith in humanity quite as much as we may have, because we'll recognize that people don't change until they're ready to. People have to feel safe enough to change. When we ask people to stop eating animals, we are not simply asking for a change of behavior. We're asking for a shift of consciousness. We're asking for people to question authorities that they have believed in throughout their lives. We're asking for people to join a minority group that they may feel threatened to become a part of. We're asking people to break a lifetime of conditioning. We are asking people to potentially risk important relationships in their lives. And vegan, non-vegan relationships can work, and they can work fine. But for many people, it can be a challenge to navigate that difference. We are asking people to open up to the reality of animal suffering in the world. And once you open your heart and your mind to this reality, your life is never the same. People need to be ready to change, or they will watch Earthlings with their head and not take it in with their heart. And it won't stick. They won't make the change. If we can accept that, we can relax and not be shocked and horrified and angry when people don't change after listening to us or learning about the issue. We also need to know when to advocate and when not to advocate. There are certain situations that are better for us to not advocate in. Don't advocate to psychopaths. I mean, I put this here for a reason. So psychopathy, by definition, is a person who is a psychopath, I should say, by definition, is incapable of feeling empathy. The vast majority, 99% of humans, can feel empathy. They fall somewhere on that empathic continuum. I think about 10% of them are toward the lower end of that continuum. But most people do have a capacity for empathy. Some people don't. For those people who really just don't care and don't get it, there's no reason to keep fighting and pushing and trying to make them care. I mean, unfortunately, there are over 7 billion people in the world today. We have a lot of people to choose from when we choose to advocate. Move on. Advocate to the low-hanging fruit. Focus on the person who's most likely to hear your message and actually make the change. The animals need people who change their behaviors, not people who suck our energy and don't change. When emotions are high, it's best not to advocate when emotions are high. When people are already in a triggered position or an argument, that's a good time to leave the conversation off the table. Or when your emotions are high, if you feel that that charge of anger, for example, that's a good sign that it's probably not time to communicate. People will pick up on your feelings and become increasingly defensive. If somebody is deeply invested in carnism, chances are they're going to be deeply defended against hearing about carnism. There's no reason to be debating the ethics of eating animals with a hunter who's been hunting their entire life when there's somebody next door who's probably, or potentially willing to change their behaviors. And when your sustainability will be compromised, and by sustainability, I mean your ability to maintain a level of energy, psychological, emotional, and physical, so that you feel grounded, balanced, and fulfilled as a person and as a vegan. Many, many vegans feel like they have to advocate all the time. They have to be that person at the party who's saying why you shouldn't eat animals. Give yourself a break. You don't have to advocate all the time. In fact, if you are advocating all the time, there's a really good chance you're going to burn out and get exhausted. Pay attention to what's happening inside of you. If you're feeling that trigger, if you're feeling, oh God, not again. You know what I'm talking about? Not again. I have to be the person to raise awareness, to talk about this issue. Give yourself a break. It's okay. You being sustainable and staying in the movement and being an effective, fulfilled activist will do more for the animals than you trying to advocate at every possible opportunity. One of the most important things I believe that vegans, people, can do, everybody can do, is to learn effective communication. Effective communication it's amazing to me. I am constantly shocked by the fact that we go through an entire first quarter of our lifetime being educated, consistently educated for hours and hours a day, and yet we are never educated on how to relate to other human beings and animals in a way that is fundamentally respectful and healthy. We never learn this, and we pay a high price as individuals in our own relationships and as humanity in the mess of the world that we have created and continue to create. Effective communication is not simply about how you communicate, it's about how you are as a person in relationship, in interaction with others. When you learn the principles and skills of effective communication, it can transform your life. And it can make it so much easier to know what you want, what you need, and how to talk about these things and relate to others in a way that fulfills you and energizes you rather than drains you, regardless as to how different your ideologies may be. I have a whole workshop I give on this, and it's like 6 hours long. I won't get into it now, but I will suggest that you read this book called Messages because it outlines the principles for effective communication more effectively than any book I've ever found. So this is also on our website, on our Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy website at veganadvocacy.org. You can link to this resource. One of the key principles of effective communication is focusing on process rather than content when you're communicating. The content is what you are talking about. It could be whether to stay in or go out on a Saturday night, or whether to have milk or not in your refrigerator, or whether to eat animals or not. The content is always changing. The process is how you communicate. If you have a healthy process, which all of us can learn how to do, it's a skill you can learn. Anybody can learn it. When you have a healthy communicative process, you can talk about anything. It doesn't mean it's always easy, but it's a whole lot easier. The process is the how. And in a healthy communicative process, our goal is not to be right, it's not to win, and it's not to change somebody else. Our goal is to be understood and to understand the other. In a healthy communicative process, our goal is to deeply understand the other and to be understood by the other. When that is our goal, and we're communicating with compassion, and we're communicating with clarity, and we're communicating with self-awareness, people are much, much more open to what we have to say. Try to avoid taking the moral high ground. This is seriously the most judgmental baby I've ever seen. And anyway, vegans, those of us who are not direct victims of violence, are often perceived as moralizing or moralistic when we communicate about the violence. Can you relate to this? Do you get this a lot? Right? So, you're just moralistic. You're just taking the moral high ground. It's, think about the difference between a war veteran, somebody who's been in war, speaking out against war, and a student who's an anti-war activist, right? The student is perceived as moralizing. The veteran is often not. So those of us who are vegans, we're advocates, we're not the direct victims. So there's this automatic assumption among people, well, you made a choice that I haven't made. And that can create a level of defensiveness and a perception of us as being morally superior, even if we don't feel that we are. Now, the problem is that a lot of times vegans actually do feel that they are morally superior. So the challenge for us is to not maintain that attitude, because if you do perceive yourself as morally superior, people will know. People will pick up on that. When we perceive ourselves as superior, how do other people feel in our presence? Inferior, right? What is the feeling of being, take a moment and think about this. When you feel inferior, what is that feeling? Yeah, well, it causes frustration, right? It's the feeling of being less than. The feeling of being inferior is the feeling of being less than. It's actually shame. Shame is an incredibly debilitating feeling. Shame is the emotion that arguably lies at the foundation of most, if not all, of the dysfunctional dynamics in human relationships and in our relationships in the world, in social dynamics. One of the best ways to get somebody to do the opposite of what we want them to do is to shame them. Shamed people attack or withdraw. Shamed people typically do not feel that they don't feel an agency to take action on their own or others' behalves. When we look at somebody and we judge them, we are judging people. Looking at them as less than is inherently, fundamentally shaming. If there's one practice that we can try to implement, it's to be less and ideally non-judgmental when we're relating to others. Moral superiority does not serve us. It does not serve the animals. It works against our goal, and it's not, frankly, accurate. Who's more morally superior? The person who never eats animals but isn't really that compassionate to the people in their orbit, or the person who is deeply compassionate humanitarian that may be saving hundreds of thousands or millions of people and eats animals? I don't know. These comparisons are difficult and ultimately not serving us. Not judging people takes work. It's especially when you're vegan and you're frustrated and you're living in this world full of meat eaters that can make it, very easy to become deeply frustrated and morally frustrated. So getting to a place where we're less judgmental means becoming self-aware, becoming aware of ourselves and allowing ourselves, trying our best to empathize with others, to look at the world through others' eyes when we're talking with them. When we really deeply commit to understanding what the world looks like through the other's eyes, it's a lot more difficult to judge them. I always recommend that on a very practical level, we advocate through sharing our own story. All of my advocacy, this is me like a million years ago. But this is me close to 50 years ago. I always advocate personally through sharing my own story. If somebody asks you why you're vegan, you can list all of the facts, all of the reasons why they should be vegan. God, because how many animals die for animal agriculture and the level of torture and environmental destruction and the human rights violation. You can give them all the facts, or you can say, I'm vegan because I learned about what happens to the animals and the environment in my own body through the production and consumption of animal products, and I didn't want to be a part of that. I'm vegan because, and you share your story, and keep it short. Keep it short. When you share your story, nobody can make your story wrong. It's your story. And if they want more information, they'll ask you for more information. When you share your story, it's an invitation for people to look at the world through your eyes, to bear witness, to see the truth through your eyes. And it's often safer for people to see the truth through somebody else's eyes than through their own when we're asking them to witness violence. And this is the role of artists often in social change. Artists give us the opportunity to look at the world through their eyes and to bear witness through them, which is for many people a safer way to bear witness. And to bear witness is simply to see the truth with our eyes and minds as well as with our hearts. I also suggest, this actually was taken in Luxembourg like a couple of years ago, I think, here, to illuminate carnistic defenses without necessarily naming them. Carnistic defenses lose much of their power when we shine a light on them. A lot of their power comes from the fact that they're unconscious. They're like in the driver's seat of people's psyche, and people don't know that their psyche or their mentality is being driven by these mechanisms. So we can illuminate carnistic defenses. I do this when I'm talking to meat eaters, maybe hundreds of meat eaters on a stage or just sitting next to somebody on an airplane and, say like, for example, I used to eat animals. I just didn't make the connection between the meat on my plate and the living being it once was. I just didn't think about that. That defense is dissociation. I'm illuminating the defenses. I used to believe in this. What I learned is myth. I learned now that these are myths, that eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. These myths that we learned about a lot of things like slavery. When you illuminate carnistic defenses, it's amazing. People will be like, yeah, because this is an experience that everybody has. And very often the reaction is like one of empathy. Find common ground. Find what you have in common with the person you're communicating with. It's so easy, like when we're vegans, to think like, I'm vegan, you're not vegan, you're the other. How many of you at some point in your life ate meat, eggs, and or dairy? Raise your hand. Yeah, look around the room. That's just about everybody. It's like, I think Tobias, are you here? Okay, Tobias he's heard my talk too many times. Tobias calls this like a vegan amnesia, right? So like we feel like when we become vegan, sometimes because the shift of consciousness is like so powerful, it's like we forget what it was like. We forget that we were ever not vegan. And we'll be like, how could he do that? Look at him, he's just like tearing into that piece of chicken like it's a piece of food. That was you 5 months ago. That's how could he do that? We have to remember your own carnism. Remember your own carnism. It's not fair that we have to work so hard on effective communication. It's not fair that we have to be the ones to bridge this vegan carnist gap. It's not fair, but that's the reality, because guess what? We are bilingual. We are bilingual, and we are talking to people who are not. So don't expect them to suddenly start speaking your language that they never learned before. Speak their language. And let them know that you understand. When people ask me if I'm vegan, first of all, I always say I am today, but for much of my life, I wasn't. And I can literally, it's like, oh, thank God. Oh, she gets it. For much of my life, I wasn't. Let them know you understand. And don't fake it. None of this, what I'm talking about here, is about being manipulative. People know when they're being manipulated. And manipulation is fundamentally disrespectful. Manipulation is against all the values that we're trying to bring into the world through our work, through veganism. Be authentic. Come from an authentic place. When we're non-judgmental, be authentically non-judgmental to the best of your ability. When you're remembering your carnism and talking to people about eating animals, do that from an authentic place to the best of your ability. Because if you don't, first of all, it's not respectful, and secondly, it's not strategic. Most people know, and nobody likes to be manipulated. I also recommend that we build on existing compassion. So often I hear this, somebody, meat eater will say, like, I love animals. And the vegan will be like, no, you don't, you eat them. Right? Well, I used to eat animals and I loved animals. I loved my dog. I loved pigs. I would never want to hurt them. I was conditioned by the system to act against what I actually feel and believe. It's quite possible to love animals and to eat them too. In fact, it's quite true for many, many people in the world today. Build on existing compassion. When somebody says to me, for example, that, and this happens more and more these days. So because the vegan movement's been along for longer and it's becoming increasingly powerful. Oh, yeah. Oh, Melanie, you're vegan. That's great. Yeah. I used to be vegan. You've heard this? I used to be vegetarian. The first question I ask them is not, well, what's the first question you want to ask them? Why did you stop? Right? The first question that I like to ask them is, oh, why did you become vegan in the first place? There's a big difference between why did you stop and why did you start. Because when you ask them why they became vegan in the first place, you're inviting them to reconnect with their own thoughts and feelings and choices. And more often than not, it's a really interesting story. And at the end of the story, the conversation is like, oh, yeah, maybe it makes sense for me to try this again. I really did. I was really upset after I saw these videos. And it's always useful to build on existing compassion. There's a Buddhist quote that I love so much. I use it in basically every talk I ever give. So a lot of you here probably heard it a lot. But anyway, it says, we all have within us the seeds of greed, hatred, and desire. And we also have within us the seeds of love, compassion, and empathy. Our job is just to water the right seeds. What we focus on grows. Connect with that compassion in people. I had this woman sitting next to me on an airplane. I used to have a lot of conversations on airplanes when my talk was only in the US, because the Americans like to talk to you all the time on airplanes. And this woman was like, oh, so you're giving a talk. Oh, you wrote this book. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I love animals too. And meanwhile, she was eating chicken next to me, literally eating chicken. And she was telling me how much I love dogs. I rescue dogs. And she has this whole, she's got a bunch of dogs in her backyard, and they're building a barn for them now, and she wants to start a shelter. And I said to you, that's great. I wish there were more people in the world that loved animals and were willing to take action on their behalf, because the animals have a really hard time in this world. There is a lot of suffering that they go through, and they need our compassion now more than ever. And that's why I do what I do, talking about animals and animal issues. And by the end of the conversation, she didn't finish her chicken, she was talking about how she really wants to become vegetarian. And it was simply because I was watering those seeds in her. I saw that genuine compassion in her, that genuine sensitivity. And I spoke to the compassion, not the defenses. When you're communicating with people, talk to their compassion. Don't talk to the defense. I briefly mentioned this before. Don't over-inform. We often feel like, oh my God, you've got to know everything. Before this conversation ends, I want you to know everything there ever is to know about veganism and how you can be vegan starting now. And, people have a limited ability to take in information, and we don't need to do this. We don't need to give people tons of information. Colleen Patrick Goudreau, who you guys might know here, another vegan author and a good friend of mine, says, plant seeds. That's your goal. Your goal is to plant seeds. Speak your truth. Share your story. Give people enough information to be interested. And if they want more, they'll come to you. Give them some links. Offer to follow up and communicate with them. Offer to help them. Grown-ups, adults, they don't like to feel controlled by people. Allow them the space to think about this and to choose to take action themselves. I recommend avoiding what I call reductive thinking. Reductive thinking is like what happens in our minds when we reduce a person to nothing other than a behavior, right? Instead of being an individual who's loved and who's lost, who has dreams and hopes and people who care about them and people they care about, you are nothing other than a meat eater. And this happens in all different circumstances. You get in the car, if you drive in Boston, like I used to, this happens a lot, that person who cuts you off is like the asshole driver. This particularly happens with vegans if we're eating across from somebody who's eating animals. In our mind, they go from this to this. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. So avoid reductive thinking and know your own boundaries. For some people, sitting across from people when they eat meat is intolerable. If you can't tolerate that, don't do it. Take care of yourself. Try not to internalize carnism, in particular, secondary defenses. We start out feeling like we're all fine, but don't believe these myths that you hear from the dominant culture that vegans are picky eaters. How many of you have heard that? You're a picky eater. You're just so nothing is good enough for you. Just pick off so the salad has some meat on it. Pick the meat off the salad and eat the lettuce. The same way that a meat eater would not just pick off golden retriever and eat the salad, it makes sense that you would not do that. Veganism is not about being a picky eater. Veganism is not about being too sensitive. How many of you have heard this? Oh my God, you're too emotional. You can relate to this? This argument that proponents of social justice movements, and the vegan movement is a social justice movement, no question about it, are too sensitive or too emotional, has been used throughout history to silence and discredit people who speak out against violence and oppression. People who fought against slavery in the United States, the abolitionists, were called overly emotional. Feminists are called overly emotional. Just remember that when it comes to the atrocity that is carnism, your emotions, our emotions of sadness, grief, and anger are normal, healthy, and appropriate emotions. It's something to be proud of, not ashamed of. When it comes to eating animals and animal issues, the world needs more emotion, not less. Try to avoid perfectionism. Perfectionism is a problem that plagues people in general. It's a problem in all social justice movements. It's a human problem. And it's a problem in particular, or at least what I've seen in particular with vegans among veganism. Really, it's very, very important for us to be thinking more strategically and less perfectionistically. Perfectionism is exhausting, it's impossible, and it does not serve the animals. There's so much time and energy wasted with vegans fighting among themselves about whether, trace whatever lactose in soy cheese or, various byproducts or way foods are produced are really vegan or not. And it turns people off in the mainstream. Somebody in the mainstream who's basically eating so much meat, they're brushing their teeth with it, hearing us talk about these little trace ingredients and, what really is veganism, it not only does it turn them off, but it exhausts and burns out activists, and it creates a lot of division and infighting among us that sucks the energy out of a movement that needs all the energy it can get. The animals need us to do what works. The animals need us to be strategic. The animals need us to constantly be asking ourselves, what is the impact on animals going to be if I say or do this? The good news is that there is no incompatibility between being a moral person and being a strategic person when it comes to veganism or other issues. Practicing nonviolence towards self, compassion toward ourselves, allowing ourselves to be human and to be messy and not perfectionistic and to make mistakes, that is practicing compassion and justice toward ourselves and recognizing our humanity for what it is. We can do that, and we can be strategic, and this is what the animals need us to do. It's important for us to be able to say, I don't know. One of the projections on vegans, or one of the way that vegans can get stereotyped, is by being seen as, you have to be an expert. We're expected to be experts on everything. Do you relate to this? Like when you're talking about veganism, okay, what about agricultural economics? Well, how are we going to fix the economic system? Hydroponic, veganic, mushroom farming. We're expected to be experts on nutrition and on economics and on global warming and climate change and animal welfare issues. And if we're not, then it becomes an excuse to invalidate everything that invalidate veganism. Don't buy into this. This is not accurate, right? Nobody can be an expert on everything. No single person or single group of people has the answer to this massive global millennial problem that is carnism. We simply can't. It's okay to say, I don't know. This is part of not being perfect. Another very important thing that we all need to focus on is recognizing that the level of trauma, secondary traumatic stress disorder, STSD, is like PTSD, except it affects people who witness or see violence rather than people who are the direct victims of violence. A lot of vegans suffer from the trauma or traumatization that comes from seeing the violence that is out there in the world. Can you guys relate to this? It's a big problem. It's a really big problem. I have a whole talk on just this, but for now, the most important thing I'm going to suggest is to recognize secondary traumatic stress for what it is. Recognize, for example, if you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling burned out, if you're feeling like your emotions are too charged as the result of your activism, if you're feeling like you're losing faith in humanity, if your relationships are becoming increasingly problematic, pay attention to what's happening inside of you and in your life, and take care of yourself. Secondary trauma is something that is preventable when we have the right tools and the right skills, and it's something that is reversible when we have the right tools and the right skills. I'm going to give you 2 tools right now. 1, don't overwitness. There are people who will suggest that we watch videos and we look at graphic imagery to keep us inspired and to keep us passionate. The problem is, once you are already part of the solution, you don't need to do that anymore. When you do it, it increases your level of trauma. Traumatized people are less effective people in general. Traumatized activists are less effective and often ineffective, counterproductive. We owe it to the animals and we owe it to ourselves. We are animals too. To stop traumatizing ourselves. Don't look at something upsetting, graphic imagery, unless you have to. In my job, sometimes I have to. I can't avoid it. And if I know that it's going to be too much for myself, I wait until there's a better time to see it. But I do not. If somebody starts talking to you and says to you, oh my God, I just saw the most horrible thing. There was this pig and she was running across the floor and all of a sudden this person came up. Did you feel yourself getting nervous? So if somebody says that, starts telling you something, ask them, please don't share that with me. It's too much for me. It's not good for me. Ask them to stop, and don't do it to other people. Ask their permission. If you want to share something with them that's distressing and traumatic, ask their permission first. And if they say no, respect that. The other tool, a much better tool, is to read this book, Trauma Stewardship. This is also in our resources. Trauma Stewardship. The whole book is for activists. It's not just animal rights activists, all activists. It's about recognizing secondary trauma and treating secondary trauma and creating a life that is resilient to secondary trauma. But I have 5 minutes for Q&A, right? Okay, all right, so then I have 2 more slides. Okay, be solutionary. When we're talking to people, the tendency is to focus on what's wrong and how horrible it is, and you won't believe this, this, and this. Be solutionary. People can get really turned off when they feel like the problem is so huge that there's nothing they can do. Focus on what's positive and focus on how people can be a part of the solution. I suggest making comparisons carefully. If you're comparing animal and human suffering, I suggest never, ever saying the animals have it worse than humans. Even if you believe that to be true, it's not strategic. It turns people off. It makes people angry. And it will not serve our purpose. The most effective way to compare this is not to compare the experience of the victims, but to compare the mentality that enables violence. The mentality that enables all violence is the same whether it enables us to turn animals into objects in our minds or humans into objects in our minds. It's distancing, disconnecting psychology. And finally, I talked about this, practice compassion toward self. I believe that if everybody in the movement were more self-focused, paid more attention to what we need, what's happening inside of ourselves, and honored and respected ourselves the way that we want the world to respect animals, we would have a much more empowered movement. You deserve to be happy and fulfilled. You are animals too. Treat yourself the way that you want other animals to be treated. Change starts within, with us. And just remember there's reason to hope. It's very easy to feel despair in this world of overwhelming sadness and violence and suffering. But the vegan movement, and I'm in a very privileged position to be able to say this because I've traveled to many, many countries and all over the world, and I see this everywhere I go, and I hear this from meat eaters and vegans alike everywhere I go. The vegan movement is one of the fastest growing social justice movements in the world today. And we are part of something that is greater than our individual selves, and that's something to be deeply grateful for and proud of. So I want to just end with thank you for all that you do and for being a part of the solution. Thank you.